For someone that has made multiple Fallout videos, with many of them being my most popular ever, you would think that I've always been a huge fan of the series, but almost ironically, that couldn't be any further from the truth. When I was growing up, my first Bethesda game ever was Oblivion, and from the moment I set my eyes on Cyrodiil, I was utterly hooked to the Elder Scrolls. I loved the exploration, the music, and the almost whimsical nature you would feel traveling through the wilderness and stumbling upon a new monster hidden in the tree line. It instantly solidified an early love for Bethesda for me, and that love carried over to Skyrim and even bouts with Morrowind. In fact, this love is what eventually convinced me to give other Bethesda IPs a shot as well, primarily Fallout. And yet, when I finally got around to trying Fallout for the first time, I hated it. I remember booting up Fallout 3 specifically as a kid and finding the introduction cumbersome and boring. I didn't care about the characters or world, and I was skipping every dialogue prompt and furiously running around trying to get out of the vault to see what was outside. And when I finally did, I wasn't met with a beautiful vista and serene, cozy feeling like in the Elder Scrolls, but rather, I was greeted by a completely barren, desolate, and gray wasteland. As I traversed my way around, everywhere I looked was nothing but rocks and rubble. And in the very first town I walked into, I found an abandoned school full of sadistic raiders who were cutting people's heads off and attacking me. This wasn't at all like the Elder Scrolls, at least in theming, and the relentlessly depressing and worrisome atmosphere in Fallout really turned me off at first. Even when I eventually got around to playing Fallout 4, which had a much less sinister tone, I too found it to have subpar writing and questing, and I quickly gave up on it. And maybe most damning for those of you watching, the absolutely beloved RPG that is Fallout New Vegas was by far my worst first impression of the bunch, as I went in being told it was the best, but found the introduction so tedious I could barely stay awake. And for years after giving all three of these games a shot a couple of times here and there, I just came to the conclusion that Fallout wasn't for me. I was an Elder Scrolls fan through and through, and a post-apocalyptic version of the same formula took away everything that I liked. Well, that's what I thought, until I started making YouTube videos. Because you see, some of the original content I made that helped this channel grow were icebergs, and despite knowing that I wasn't a big fan of Fallout, I also knew how much of a fan base it had, and I guessed correctly that an iceberg going over crazy mysteries would do really well. But what was maybe most surprising in that entire ordeal was just how deep into the lore I got. I knew Fallout had vaults and lots of strange things, but I didn't realize just how interesting they were. As I learned more and more about Fallout and its history, along with the vaults and some of the more wild quests, suddenly my imagination began to go wild. Even after finishing multiple videos on the series and releasing them, I still couldn't get the lore and world building out of my head. I was so fixated on just how fascinating the world of Fallout really was. And suddenly, just like that, I once again had an undying urge to give this series one more shot. For Fallout 3, now knowing so much of the lore, I found the introduction fascinating, really taking my time to roleplay living in a vault and what it would be like. The dreary demeanor of the outside world was now captivating, as I knew some of the absolutely insane vaults that awaited me, and playing them for the first time myself was even more fun than any explanation could give. In Fallout 4, I learned to appreciate the crafting mechanics, which became extremely fun, and building and searching my way through the wasteland became a guilty pleasure for months. And Fallout New Vegas, despite how boring and lacking I still find it in so many ways, once I got into it on hardcore survival mode, it proved to me that it had immaculate writing and quest design that I was craving from this series, along with a lot of ways to build my character with stakes so high. And even going back and looking into especially Fallout 2 from Interplay, I grew to absolutely adore these games too. The hilarious moments and setups, the super deep RPG mechanics and tactics, and really dark and twisted events that left my mouth agape. But maybe most surprising of all, even Fallout 76 can be super fun, with the best environments in the series and multiple updates that make it fun to play and engage with, especially with friends. And really, overall, I have just done a complete 180 on the Fallout series. What started as something I would literally get depressed at playing, and a franchise I look down upon when compared to The Elder Scrolls, has in many ways surpassed it. Because while each game is much different from the last, they all have that unique quality of a harrowing world with wacky and fun themes. And when that's all centered around vaults meant for human torture and experimentation, the universe has practically endless ideas it could use to craft interesting stories and narratives that live on with us long after we finish playing. And it goes to show just how powerful good lore and world building can really be, especially when you take the time to understand it. And it's why after making videos like my Fallout Iceberg or my deep dives into every single vault, I get such strong urges to play again, because knowing the lore behind a game makes it even more fun to play with and interact with because you really understand what's going on. And it's also why I love making so many videos regarding lore and mysteries on this channel, because I hope to inspire you guys who watch them to play some of the games that I've fallen in love with too. And I think there's no better way to do that than have you fall in love with the world behind it all. I wish more than anything I could go back in time and play the Mass Effect trilogy for the first time all over again. There really isn't any other franchise out there quite like it, and with each new installment, things were reinvented while keeping the core of what makes the series great. And that's why during the original announcement of the second game when I was a kid, I was beyond excited. I watched every cinematic hype trailer, read every article, and consumed any little bit of media I could up until the release. And when I finally got my hands on Mass Effect 2, I was in awe. The huge cast of cool characters, the new pseudo-villain with the elusive man, and the now famous ending where you can potentially lose your entire crew that you've spent hours with up to this point. I hadn't played any games where the stakes were so high in my life, and considering it was from a series where I absolutely adored the first game, I was hooked. But strangely, over time, my opinion on Mass Effect 2 has taken a complete turn for the worst. You see, even going back today and playing Mass Effect 1 or 3, I feel a sense of magic that is hard to describe. It's like the games were made specifically for me. And while Mass Effect 2 has some of that, I think in retrospect, going back and playing years later many times, it's not only the worst Mass Effect in the original trilogy, but also is missing so much of what I love about the series. First of all, as cool as the characters were on my first playthrough, going back and spending time with them now feels a lot more boring. After playing games like Cyberpunk 2077, and even later BioWare titles like Dragon Age Inquisition, in comparison, the companions in Mass Effect 2 feel so hollow and one-dimensional. Sure, there are some pretty decent arcs like Liara becoming the Shadow Broker, Thane coming to the light, or Jack learning to love again, but the writing on offer here, while fine, doesn't hold a candle to more modern and mature takes on relationships in games I play now. But that's just one personal opinion. I still definitely get why people adore these characters so much, and there are some standouts here for me too, like Mordin, Tali, or Legion, who are really awesome. But even with these characters, their greatest moments are in the first and third game, not the second. My true biggest gripe with the second installment in the trilogy though, is it lost a lot of my favorite aspects, especially from the first game, like world building. You see, in the first Mass Effect, at one point at the start of the game, you land on the Citadel for the first time and are essentially stuck there for hours while you talk to aliens and get to know the universe. And while for many people this might sound and was boring, it's exactly what made this series so special for me in the first place. The original game was all about world building, exploring the galaxy, and learning about brand new worlds and species we'd never seen before. In contrast, the second game feels like a bunch of character stories set in a generic universe that culminate in a climactic ending. And to top it off, none of these characters have any real agency. Shepard can be as mean or nice to them as possible, and they still follow him into battle, as opposed to something like, say, Dragon Age Origins, where companions will turn against you and try to kill you if you wrong them. But the even bigger thing is, I don't play Mass Effect for the characters. I know a lot of people do, but for me, far and away what makes this series great is the world building and writing. Learning about the Reapers, Sovereign, the Rachni, the Thorian, or the Protheans is just so much more interesting than learning about why some random goth girl with tattoos is angry. Because honestly, I've played a lot of games with characters that have mommy and daddy issues that they have to work out with the help of the player character, and many do it better than Mass Effect, sorry to say. I've played plenty of games with bromances and friendships that really stand out, and Mass Effect, as great as it is, isn't something truly special with people even like Garrus and Rex. But what was and is truly special about Mass Effect is the world and stories it tells. I mean, truly, discovering things like the rack knife for the first time in a top secret research facility on Noveria is so much more interesting than having a love interest with an NPC that will pretty much like you no matter what you do. And on top of that, the second Mass Effect barely moves the plot forward. If you really take a step back and think about what actually changed with the story of Mass Effect 2, it's essentially just a filler episode of a TV show with a cool ending, where sure you get to meet a lot of characters that you build connections with for Mass Effect 3, but the actual narrative and what happens here is so disjointed and pointless. You could literally just play Mass Effect 1 and 3 and the main plot would essentially stay exactly the same. The only issue is you would have less background on some of the characters and you wouldn't know who the elusive man is at first. Whereas in the first game you get great build-ups and reveals like meeting Sovereign and discovering he's a Reaper for the first time. In Mass Effect 2, Cerberus is just everywhere and has all the resources they need with no justification or build-up outside of one small mission in Mass Effect 1. And even looking at something I enjoy about the second game like the ending, I actually even like the ending of say the first game even more. It was more spectacular, more movie-like, the stakes felt higher, and the main bad guy we were going up against felt so much more imposing, along with the environment in my opinion being so much more fascinating and awe-inspiring. Or what about even the combat, another stumbling block for the second installment? Whereas in the first game the combat was extremely janky, it allowed for hilarious builds like being a biotic who could literally throw bosses off the map with force pushes that would send them 100 feet in the sky. In contrast, the third game felt super refined and fun, with tactical third-person combat that was balanced and actually fun to play, even for modern shooter standards. But the second game in comparison was a weird middle ground between the two that was janky and refined at the same time, with a lack of true identity that BioWare finally found in Mass Effect 3 and Andromeda. Or essentially, in retrospect, I really and truly believe that Mass Effect 2 is far and away the worst game of the original trilogy, and I don't even think it's close. And for any of you that still disagree with me and do say the second game is the best, after all it's by far the most loved if you read about it online, I have a test for you. Play Cyberpunk 2077 and do all the character missions there, and then go back and play the entire Mass Effect trilogy, and tell me that you're still in love with the second game and that the characters are what make this series great. Because in my opinion, they were always cool and fun, but never absolutely amazing. And because the second game focused so much on them rather than the world building, lore, story, and universe, what actually made Mass Effect special, the second game suffered greatly. So much so that nowadays when I replay the trilogy, I struggle getting through it and want to just skip it. Because the true beauty of Mass Effect isn't the characters. They are an important aspect and do make the games better. But the core of this series was always the huge set pieces and unbelievable reveals that made you sit back in awe and think about a universe that doesn't exist, but one you can get utterly lost in. Not every game has to be fun, but that's hard to understand until you really play one that shows you why that is. And for me, maybe no game did that better than Death Stranding. You see, when I first played the title when it originally dropped on PC, it took me only a couple of hours before I was begging for it to stop. The gameplay consisted of nothing other than walking around and stumbling over rocks, and every story beat and moment was characterized by complete confusion and what felt like a pretentious spectacle whose sole purpose was to draw attention and fruitless intrigue. It was the first time I had ever actually played a Kojima game outside of PT, and well, I wasn't a fan. I wanted an experience that was more engaging and interesting right off the bat, one that had actual deep gameplay systems to learn and a story that made sense. So I put the title down and forgot about it, and joined the legions of players online who detest it to this day because of how boring it can truly be. For many players, this is the type of title where you play the first hour and simply realize it's not for you, and for almost anyone I know in my real life that doesn't play games, I imagine this one would be a hard sell. And yet, some months after the initial PC release, something inside of me just wanted to give it another shot. And I'm so glad I did, because Death Stranding is without a doubt one of the most unique and memorable experiences I've ever had playing a game, despite how quote-unquote boring it can be at times. And that's because the journey of Death Stranding isn't about the fun, it's about something deeper than that. the beauty. When I picked up Death Stranding for the second time, I can remember the exact moment where I fell in love. A couple of hours into the main story, I had been doing nothing but running across desolate rocky landscapes, making my way past goop monsters with only the smallest inkling of what was going on. I was having a better time now that I knew what I was in for, but I wouldn't say I was necessarily having a great time. But then it happened. I got a mission to deliver some supplies to a nearby location called Port Knot City, which contained a massive warehouse next to an ocean that connected the United States through its center. And in order to get there, I had to slowly crawl my way up a massive mountain, which was littered with the goop ghost monsters, which I had to hide from before, holding my breath and walking slowly. It was one of the most tense moments in the game up to this point, but it all culminated in one of the best payoffs ever that shows why this game is so amazing. Because as you approach the ridge of this massive hill or mountain you have climbed after your efforts, suddenly you are met with a sprawling vista. And as your eyes cross the skyline, a roaring and moving track of music starts to blare through your speakers. The world seems to stand still as the hums of soft instruments fill the valley, and before you is Port Knot City in all its glory, beckoning you to come closer. Without exaggeration, this single moment here roused a deep love within me for this game for the entire remainder of the playthrough, because it showed me Death Stranding wasn't all about the walking, or the strange story and unwieldy character interactions. It was about the moments. Simply taking a breath and enjoying the beauty of the world, or closing your eyes and falling into the trance of the music. This wasn't a game like so many others that focused on combat encounters and quests. It was art, transfixed on making you feel things instead. And truthfully, it's such a hard game to sell. I've begged other people to play this game now for a while, and most people like me find it too boring or pointless and quickly put it down. But now that I've really given it a shot and figured out what this title was meant to be, I have to admit, I couldn't have been any more wrong than I was at first. Death Stranding isn't a game like so many others, and in many ways it defies what a game or gameplay loop can be. Yet despite that, I think it captures what's most important in the end anyways. Crafting an experience like no other that stays with us long after we finish playing. And on top of this, the more you dive into this world, the more it takes you in by its grasp. Simple things like the rain and its destruction begin to make more sense the further you get into the story, and the world around you comes into full focus. Suddenly you are met with boss fights that are as thematic as they are engaging to fight, and the more places and regions you uncover, the better the game gets. Whereas most games will as quickly as they can try to engage the player, Death Stranding takes its time, and because it does, results in moments that feel so much more earned and worthwhile, the kind that etch themselves into our souls and minds forever. So if you're like me and gave up on Death Stranding or never gave it a shot because it looked so mundane, trust me, there is something special in this game, and you only can truly realize it by playing it yourself. An experience not about having fun, but rather enjoying the simple things in life. Have you guys ever come back to a game you hated as a kid and wondered what you were thinking? Because for me, it happens all the time, and that's because our opinions change, our worldviews shift, and what we find enjoyable radically transforms with age. But in terms of games like this, maybe none have seen such a reversal of fate from my own condemnation quite as much as Dragon Age Origins, and really, the entire Dragon Age IP. You see, when I was growing up as a kid, without a doubt, my single favorite franchise was Mass Effect. And when I finally beat the game the first time around and found myself left with a void in my heart begging for more, I thought what better place to go than an upcoming game called Dragon Age Origins from BioWare, the same team behind Mass Effect. However, unlike Mass Effect 1, when I first played Dragon Age Origins, I wasn't a fan at all. The art design and world seemed gray, dark, and boring. The gameplay was immediately unwieldy and cumbersome. The UI and user experience was absolutely a struggle to get used to. The enemy design and threat from Loghain came off as uninspired and generic. And on top of all that, I didn't care about any of the characters around me or understand what this world was really about. I gave it a couple of hours to sink my teeth into, 2, but as time carried on, my boredom and frustration only grew. Dragon Age just didn't give me that same magical feeling that Mass Effect had years ago. So for over a decade since that point in time, I've consistently bashed Dragon Age as a series. And if I'm going to be completely honest with you guys, over a year ago when I finally made a Dragon Age iceberg after people begged for it for months, I remember thinking to myself how overrated the lore was the entire time I was making it. At least compared to a lot of other games I had already done videos on, like Elder Scrolls, Witcher, Mass Effect, and Cyberpunk. However, about a month ago as of writing this, due to a lack of new game releases that interested me, and a dying urge to play something that made me feel like Mass Effect 1 did as a kid, I decided to finally give Dragon Age one final shot, and all I can say is, I've never been so wrong, because without a doubt, this is one of the greatest role-playing games and series ever made. You almost forget just how good old school BioWare games were when you haven't played one for a while, but almost immediately this time when I picked up Origins, I was swept up in the world. You get to pick from 6 different starting states or origins right at the beginning of the game, and each of these provides hours of custom content that you only get to see if you play as that origin character. For example, I picked a human mage who found himself at the Circle of Magi, and it was here that I learned about the harrowing, a grueling trial all apprentices must undergo in order to become a full mage, and if they fail, they transform into a monstrosity that must be slain or trapped forever in the nightmare realm known as the Fade, which is separated from the mortal realm by a barrier called the Veil, which mages pierce through to tap into magic, which opens them up to demonic possession. And it's ideas like this that are instantly front and center that make the series so special. Just like with Mass Effect, Dragon Age is a world full of interesting lore and backstories, like the Tranquil I found at the Circle of Magi in my origin story, who are mages that lose their ability to see the Fade, and with it, their connection and emotions to the real world, making them act like mindless husks. And it's a world full of dark and gritty themes too, of torture and abuse, war and betrayal, but also, along the way you get to assume a group of lovable and memorable characters like Alistair, Leliana, and Morrigan. Whenever I had tried Origins before my most recent playthrough, I always struggled to get into the gameplay and combat, and that also resulted in me skipping through the dialogue and not getting immersed in the world at all. But playing it again now that I'm older, I love how tactical it is, how many spells there are, and all the different combos and things you can do in combat that really add a lot of depth to the experience. Because if you're really in the mood for something more slow and introspective like Origins, it just works so well. You can sit and talk with NPCs with tons of dialogue choices to choose from, and every book or pamphlet you find on the ground adds an extensive entry into your codex to dig into the lore even more. And really, it just goes to show how much better a game feels when the world building is top notch. Even though the graphics now are very dated in Origins, and especially the Fade sections are annoying to glare at, it's easy to look past that when the stories and history of this world you are in are told in such fascinating ways that you start to read pages of text about fake events in a place you didn't care about just an hour before. Because Dragon Age Origins world building is truly unmatched. The ideas of what lyrium even is, what the Magisters did at the Black City, the conspiracies behind the Tranquil, the inner workings of the Fade, the mysteries of the long-forgotten and powerful empires of the old elves and dwarves, and what will happen when there are no more old gods for blights. And these are all topics that are touched on and expanded in such fascinating ways in Dragon Age 2 and Inquisition, and now after playing through the entire series recently, I'm so excited for Veilguard and where it could potentially go, especially when it comes to the world building and lore of this fascinating series. And honestly, I have no idea how I didn't find this stuff interesting before, because in retrospect, after playing Dragon Age Origins first and then going on to the other games, rather than mainly only playing a little bit of Inquisition like I did before, you get so much more context into why all of these topics are so cool, and even going back and watching my very own iceberg lore video on the series which I made, it's so much more interesting to me now that I've played Origins in full. When a game has a universe and world building as good as this, it can quite literally make everything that comes after it even better. For example, while I found Dragon Age 2 boring and Inquisition tedious at times after playing Origins, man did some of the lore and moments hit so much harder even in those games because of how much Origins had immersed me in this world. And really, there's nothing else to say besides I got it wrong. If you've ever heard me mention on this channel how I don't like the Dragon Age series that much, you can just ignore that from now on. Because Origins, and really the whole Dragon Age series, is without a doubt some of the best role-playing games ever made, with fun and memorable casts of characters, a captivating story in each, deep gameplay builds and tactics, especially in Origins, and a world you can get utterly lost in.